The bailiff's hand on my shoulder was firm, almost gentle, like he was sorry about what was happening. I stood in that courtroom in handcuffs, actual metal handcuffs, cold and tight around my wrists, charged with possession of 2 kilos of cocaine and resisting arrest. The 2 officers who had filed the complaint sat in the front row in their pressed uniforms, looking like they had already won. They looked satisfied, composed, certain. They had absolutely no idea what was about to walk through those courtroom doors. But let me start from the beginning, because what happened over the next hours in that courtroom was only possible because of everything that came before it. I had been with the DEA for years. Years of undercover operations, blown cover scares, late nights in government-issue sedans parked outside warehouses that smelled like chemical rot and bad decisions. I was a special agent, GS-13, which meant I had earned every single thing on my record through fieldwork, not paperwork. My supervisor, Director Vance Harlan, called me the closer behind my back, which I only discovered when his assistant accidentally CC'd me on an internal memo. I didn't mind the nickname. It was accurate. My life operated on invisible rails. I didn't discuss work at dinner. I kept a second phone in a locked drawer beneath my socks. I drove a different route to the federal building every week, rotating between 3 options on a schedule I kept only in my head. When acquaintances asked what I did for a living, I said federal law enforcement, vague enough to end conversations, specific enough to be technically true. My mother still believed I processed compliance paperwork for a government agency. I let her believe it. It kept her blood pressure manageable and her prayers shorter. That morning, I was in the final stretch of a long-running operation. We had been tracking a mid-level distribution network operating out of Claremont, Georgia, a town of roughly 40,000 people wedged between 2 interstates, unremarkable on the surface and genuinely rotten underneath. The kind of place where the hardware store owner and the county commissioner played golf together on Sunday mornings, and nobody asked inconvenient questions. We had wiretaps, financial records, and a confidential informant who had been feeding us clean intelligence for months. I remember that morning clearly, the specific crystalline clarity that only arrives afterward, when you know what it was, the last extraordinary morning. I made coffee from whole beans, dark roast, from a small shop downtown, whose owner knew my order. The apartment smelled warm and quiet, and I stood at the kitchen window, watching the garbage truck making its slow pass down the street below. 1 more week, I thought. 1 more week, and this operation closes, and I can breathe again. I dressed in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a gray blazer, ankle boots. My badge and service weapon were in the blazer's inside pocket. My secondary DEA identification was in the slim leather case pressed against my ribs. I had a confidential informant meeting scheduled, and I was running exactly on time. The traffic stop happened on Route 9, just past the interchange. I noted the exact moment out of reflex. Years of fieldwork turns timekeeping into a bodily habit. I was doing slightly over the limit. The cruiser that pulled out behind me had been sitting in the lot of a shuttered dry cleaner's, engine running, and I had clocked it in my rearview mirror before I even passed it. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Not dangerous wrong. Not yet. Just off. Textured in a way that made the back of my neck pay attention. The officer who approached my window was young, mid-20s, sandy-haired, with the kind of ease that belongs to people who have never been seriously questioned about anything. His name tag read Tate. His partner stayed in the cruiser. I noted that, too. "License and registration," he said. Not unpleasant, not warm, either. I handed them over with both hands clearly visible on the wheel and waited. After years with the agency, traffic stop protocol was automatic. Stay calm, produce documents, announce federal status only if the situation required it. Declaring yourself DEA over a minor infraction created paper trails, and paper trails in an active operation were liabilities. So I watched him in the mirror. He stayed at the cruiser for longer than necessary. A standard plate check takes far less time. I turned the radio off and sat in the particular quality of that silence. The way he stood beside the passenger window, half turned. The way he wasn't quite looking at the license. The way neither of them seemed to be waiting on a result. He came back. He leaned against my doorframe, one hand on the roof, body angled, and looked at me for a beat before he spoke. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step out of the vehicle. May I ask why?" "Routine check. Step out of the vehicle, please." The word routine landed wrong. He said it without meeting my eyes, and that small, deliberate avoidance sharpened something in me. I felt the shift. Not fear. Something more precise than fear. The heightened clinical attention that had kept me alive in multiple undercover operations, and that I had learned to trust unconditionally. "I'm a federal agent," I said, voice completely even. "My identification is inside my blazer. I'm going to reach for it slowly." He didn't step back. He didn't change expression. He just looked at me with the patience of someone following a script that had already been written. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." I stepped out. What happened in the next minutes ran like something rehearsed. The second officer, Royce, stockier, older, with the flat eyes of someone who had made professional peace with uncomfortable things, had gotten out of the cruiser while I was watching Tate. He was already moving toward my trunk before I had fully straightened up. He had gloves on, latex gloves. He had put them on before he got out of the car, before there was any legal basis to search anything. "I do not consent to a search," I said. "Probable cause?" Royce said, and opened my trunk. I watched him reach into a duffel bag I had never seen before in my life. My lungs stopped for 3 full seconds. That bag had not been in my trunk that morning. I knew this with a certainty that has nothing to do with belief and everything to do with fact. I had opened my trunk earlier to drop in a case file, and it had contained nothing except my mother's emergency kit and a forgotten umbrella. That bag was not mine. Someone had put it there, someone who knew my address, my vehicle, and the route I was going to take that morning. Royce straightened up. In his gloved hands, he held a vacuum-sealed package, pale and tight in the flat October light. He turned it once, not like a man surprised, like a man confirming something he already knew was there. "Well," he said, quiet, satisfied, not even the performance of discovery. The cold started in my feet, real cold, the kind that moves upward slowly and has nothing to do with temperature. I kept my hands at my sides. I did not reach for my badge. I processed what I was seeing with the trained part of my brain. The positioned cruiser, the extended plate check as a stall, gloves before probable cause, the bag already placed. Someone had called ahead. Someone on my team had given them my route, my car, my morning timing, and they had made their move the week before my operation was supposed to close. They were trying to bury this case before it could finish. "I need you to understand," I said, and my voice was steadier than I had any right to expect, "that I am a special agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration. My credentials are in my inside jacket pocket." "Save it for the station," Tate said and took my arm. The cuffs went on. That flat metallic click passed through me like an electric current. I stood straight. I did not resist because resisting physically was not the play, and I already knew it. The play required patience and precision, and about 6 specific phone calls. But first, there was the drive, and I needed every minute of it. The cruiser smelled like vinyl cleaner and old coffee. I sat in the back and ran the checklist. Tate's badge number, unit number, the route, which was not the direct route to the nearest precinct. They were taking me past the county line, which was an additional detail. The exact moment they finally read me my rights, not until we were pulling into the parking lot, a procedural violation I filed away like a receipt. The duffel bags, make and condition, Royce's gloves already on. Everything was a detail, and every detail was a thread. And I had years of experience pulling threads until something unraveled. The woman who processed me at the front desk was Sergeant Morales, and the look she gave me when I walked in, cuffed, blazer slightly pulled, expression completely controlled, was careful and unreadable. I asked twice for a phone call. I was told twice I'd have access shortly. I asked for the watch commander. I was told he was unavailable. They put me in an interview room with gray walls and fluorescent light buzzing at a frequency designed to erode patience. There was a table, 2 chairs, and a camera in the corner with its red indicator light on. Recording. Good. I sat down, folded my hands on the table, and thought. I went through the operation team one face at a time. Torres, my case agent, clean record, no irregularities. Park, tech analyst, new to the unit, impeccably careful. Kellen, the confidential informant handler, previous operations without incident. Director Harlan's office, which had the clearest picture of my schedule. And then, someone else. Weeks earlier, at a routine briefing, I had mentioned in passing that I ran the confidential informant meeting on Route 9 every other week. A throwaway logistics comment. I hadn't thought about it since. I was thinking about it now with complete cold clarity. Detective Calder came in after some time. 50s, gray at the temples, the kind of carefully manufactured approachability that reads as something else once you start paying attention. He sat across from me, placed a folder on the table, and didn't open it. I didn't wonder what was inside. I watched his hands. "Ms. Langford," he said, the miss flat and deliberate. "You want to explain what you were doing with 2 kilos in your vehicle?" "They're not mine," I said. "I'm a special agent with the DEA. My credentials were in my blazer at the time of my arrest. I need them returned, and I need to make a call to my supervisor at the federal building." He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not belief, not disbelief, pure calculation. "Your credentials," he repeated. "Inside jacket pocket. Leather case. It should have come in with my personal effects." He made a note and pivoted immediately to asking about my whereabouts the previous evening. That pivot told me everything. He already knew about the badge, and he wasn't interested, which meant this wasn't incompetence or an honest mistake. This was a decision someone had made. Someone had authorized this stop, this arrest, this room. Someone with enough reach inside this department to involve a detective and a watch commander and a processing sergeant who looked at me with careful, unreadable eyes. I was not dealing with 2 rogue patrol officers acting alone. The interview lasted some time. I answered what served me and declined everything else. At the end, Calder stood and told me I'd be held pending arraignment, the way you'd announce a weather forecast. "Detective," I said as he reached the door. I kept my voice quiet, measured. Whoever put those 2 officers on Route 9 this morning made a very specific choice. I'd like you to think carefully about whose name is attached to the active federal investigation into narcotics distribution in this county. Think about what happens to every piece of evidence in that case when a federal agent gets arrested on fabricated charges the week before the operation closes. Think about who benefits if this case falls apart. Think about the exposure. Think about that tonight. He stopped with his hand on the door handle. He did not turn around. A full beat passed, long enough to be intentional. Then he left. I sat back and let out one long, controlled breath. The room was cold, and the light above me buzzed steadily, indifferently. My phone was gone. My badge was gone. I had been in more dangerous places than this, genuinely uncertain situations where the margin was narrow, but there was something particular about being processed through a system I had spent years working inside, being filed and held while someone else's plan ran its course around me. It required a different discipline, not the discipline of physical stillness, the discipline of waiting without panic while you set the pieces in order. Someone had my route, my vehicle, my address, my morning timing. That knowledge did not exist outside my team. The leak had a name, and it was attached to a face I'd looked at across a briefing table not long ago. By the time I walked out of whatever courtroom they dragged me into, I was going to know exactly whose face it was, and they were going to wish profoundly and specifically that they had chosen someone else to frame. I thought about the coffee on my kitchen counter going cold. Dark roast. One more week, I thought that morning. Funny, I was going to be exactly right. They gave me one phone call later that day. I knew the exact time because the clock on the wall of the holding area had a crack in its plastic casing, and I'd been watching it for hours. The officer who walked me to the phone was young enough to look uncomfortable about it, which I filed as a minor but useful fact. I called Torres first. 4 rings, then voicemail. I left a message that was exact and short. My name, the precinct number, the time of arrest, the charges, Tate's badge number. 11 pieces of information. Anyone who needed to draw conclusions from them could draw them. I hung up and asked if I could make a second call. The officer said no. I went back to the metal bench and thought about why Torres wasn't picking up on a Tuesday afternoon. There were 3 explanations. First, a meeting. Second, he'd seen my name on the screen and something had stopped him. Third, he already knew about my arrest, which meant the information had traveled faster than I had. I spent a long, uncomfortable time with the third option. They brought me to arraignment the next morning. Transport van. Minutes. Early. I ran calculations the entire way, methodically, slowly, taking every uncomfortable answer as data rather than catastrophe. By the time the van pulled into the courthouse lot, I had a theory, clean and specific. I was genuinely hoping I was wrong. The courtroom was small. Wood paneling, fluorescent light, the faint smell of old paper and floor cleaner. The public defender assigned to me leaned in and quietly explained that the prosecution was recommending detention without bail given the quantity of narcotics involved. He said it with the tone of a man apologizing for weather. I looked at the 2 officers seated in the front row, Tate on the left, Royce on the right. Both in pressed uniforms, both with the composed, patient look of men who had done this before and expected it to go the way it always went. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. I heard him before I saw him. Director Vance Harlan walked a certain way, unhurried, deliberate, with the particular weight of someone who had spent decades making federal agencies move. He was followed by 2 people I recognized from the Office of Professional Responsibility, a woman with a laptop bag and a man carrying a manila folder the thickness of a small novel. Behind them, a U.S. Marshal I had worked alongside twice, whose name was Rivera, and who had the kind of face that did not change expression regardless of circumstances. Harlan did not look at me first. He looked at the judge, then very briefly at the prosecution table, then at Tate and Royce. That last look lasted exactly 3 seconds and communicated something I had no adequate word for. Not anger, not contempt, something colder and more administrative than either. The judge, a woman named Honorable Evelyn Hart, looked up from her papers with the measured attention of someone who had seen interruptions before, but rarely this kind. "Your Honor," Harlan said, and his voice carried without effort. "I'm Director Vance Harlan, Drug Enforcement Administration. I need to address the court regarding the individual currently before you." The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, this proceeding—" "Sit down," Judge Hart said, not unkindly, and the prosecutor sat. Harlan placed a document on the clerk's desk. The woman from OPER opened her laptop. The man with the folder set it on the prosecution table and stepped back. "The defendant," Harlan said, "is Special Agent Reese Langford, GS-13, DEA, with years of active federal service and current assignment to a narcotics distribution investigation in this county. The identification removed from her person at the time of her arrest and not entered into evidence and not made available to court-appointed counsel confirms this." He paused for exactly 1 beat. "The substance recovered from her vehicle was placed there. We have the evidence to demonstrate how, by whom, and why." The silence that followed had a specific texture. I heard someone shift in the gallery. I heard the prosecutor exhale. I heard Tate in the front row make a sound that was not quite a word, something short and involuntary that he immediately suppressed. I kept my eyes forward. My hands were folded on the defense table. Inside my chest, something that had been wound extremely tight for hours quietly began to release. "Additionally," Harlan continued, "the officers who made this arrest are connected through financial records obtained under federal warrant this morning to the primary targets of the investigation Agent Langford was conducting. Specifically, Officer Dale Royce received 3 wire transfers totaling $42,000 from a shell account linked to the Claremont network over the past months. The most recent transfer was made shortly before this arrest." Royce stood up. "That's a lie," he said. His voice was loud, and it was wrong. Too loud for the room. Too immediate. A man who had expected to be unchallenged sounds exactly like that when he is challenged. "Sit down," Judge Hart said. And this time, there was nothing kind in it at all. Royce sat. Tate beside him had gone very still. The stillness of someone reassessing every decision they had made in the past week. I watched him from the corner of my eye. His jaw was set, and his face had the particular gray quality of a man understanding in real time that the ground he was standing on was not solid. Rivera, the marshal, moved to a position near the front row with a quietness that was worse than any announcement. Judge Hart read the documents Harlan had submitted. She read them fully, which took minutes, and no one in that courtroom spoke. The fluorescent light hummed. Someone in the gallery coughed once and did not cough again. The prosecutor had the folder open in front of him and was reading it with the focused attention of a person looking for an exit that wasn't there. Finally, Judge Hart looked up. "The charges against Special Agent Langford are dismissed," she said. "With prejudice." She set the papers down with a precise, unhurried motion and looked at the prosecution table. "I will be requesting a full review of this arrest, the chain of custody for the recovered evidence, and the conduct of the officers involved." Her gaze moved to Tate and Royce. "Do not leave this building." Rivera stepped forward. Royce looked at him, and something in his face broke. Not dramatically, not with any particular theater, but cleanly and permanently. The way something breaks when it has been under sustained pressure and the last support is removed. He looked at Tate. Tate was staring at the table in front of him. The bailiff removed my cuffs. The sound they made coming off, that same flat metallic click running in reverse, was the best sound I had heard in hours. I stood up slowly, rolled my wrists once. Harlan was beside me, and he handed me the leather case with my credentials without comment. The way you return something that was never in question. Your phone was in Tate's cruiser, he said quietly. We have it. A pause. Torres called me shortly after you left the voicemail. He was in a briefing. Clean. I know, I said. And I did know by then. The voice that had said my route aloud at that briefing weeks ago had not been Torres. It had been Kellen, the confidential informant handler, the man who had been feeding us clean intelligence for months, clean intelligence about everyone except himself, and the $42,000 that had moved through a shell account with his brother-in-law's address on the registration documents. I'd found this in the folder the OPR agent had placed on the table. I read fast. Kellen, I said. Harlan nodded once. Arrested this morning. He gave up the contact inside the department inside hours. Gave up everything. He looked straight ahead. The operation closes as scheduled. You'll be on point. I thought about that for a moment. Hours in a holding cell and an arraignment on fabricated drug charges, and the operation closed as scheduled. There was something almost funny about that. Almost. Tate and Royce were escorted out of the courtroom through a side door by Rivera and 2 additional marshals. Royce went without resistance. Tate tried once, briefly, to say something to the room, to the judge, to the gallery, to no one in particular, and the words didn't form. He stopped trying. The door closed behind them. The gallery, which had been quietly filling since Harlan walked in, stirred with the particular energy of people who had witnessed something they would be describing for a long time. A woman in the 3rd row, elderly, white-haired, was looking at me with an expression I recognized after a moment as simple relief. The kind that belongs to people who have watched the machinery work badly for a long time and were not certain it could be corrected. I held her gaze for a second. Then I looked away. In the hallway outside the courtroom, the woman from OPR, her name was Ramirez, handed me a bottle of water and a pen and a form to sign acknowledging the return of my personal effects. I signed it. My hands were completely steady, which surprised me slightly, and then didn't surprise me at all. The shaking, I knew from experience, came later. It came when everything was safe and the body finally believed it. The press is going to want a statement, Ramirez said. Eventually, they'll want one, I agreed. They won't get one today. She smiled at something and didn't push it. Harlan walked me to his car, which was a black government SUV parked in a reserved spot with the particular confidence of a vehicle that expected to be there. He drove. I sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at Claremont going past. The interstates on either side, the unremarkable storefronts, the hardware store whose owner played golf with the county commissioner on Sunday mornings. All of it the same as it had looked before. All of it different because of what I now knew was underneath it. You should have called me from the cruiser, Harlan said after a while. I only had one call. You called Torres. Torres was closer to the situation. He was quiet for a moment. Next time, call me first. There won't be a next time, I said, because after this week, this network is gone. He nodded slowly. The way people nod when they agree with something and want to say more about it and decide not to. Months later, I was in my apartment on a Sunday morning with whole bean coffee and the window open in the particular quiet of a city in October that is different from September's quiet. More settled, less provisional. The operation had closed as scheduled. Dozens of indictments. The Claremont network was, in the way that mattered, finished. Dale Royce pleaded guilty to federal bribery and conspiracy charges later that year. $42,000 taken. He was sentenced to years. I read the verdict in a brief news item and felt nothing dramatic about it. Just the clean, administrative satisfaction of a record corrected. Officer Tate cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced charges and was dismissed from the force. He would not work in law enforcement again. Kellen, the confidential informant handler who had spent months feeding my team clean intelligence while feeding the network my schedule, faced obstruction of justice and conspiracy charges alongside the primary targets he had been protecting. His brother-in-law's shell account was frozen. The $42,000 was seized. It would go eventually to a fund for victims of trafficking in the same county where it had been earned. There was a specific justice in that I found genuinely satisfying. Detective Calder was placed on administrative leave pending the departmental review Judge Hart had ordered. The last thing I heard, that review was ongoing. I did not know and did not need to know where it would land. My mother called me on a Friday evening, the way she always did. We talked about her garden, about my cousin's new job, about whether I was eating properly. At the end, she said, in the particular tone she used for things she had heard third or fourth hand and was not certain of, "Someone told me you had some trouble at work recently." I thought about the holding cell, the fluorescent light, the click of the cuffs going on, and then the click of them coming off. I thought about Harlan walking through those courtroom doors. I thought about the woman in the third row with the expression of simple, tired relief. "Nothing I couldn't handle," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You always say that, because it's always been true." She made the small sound she made when she accepted something she wasn't fully satisfied with. And we talked for another while about nothing consequential, which was its own kind of luxury. On the kitchen counter, the coffee was still warm. Dark roast, whole bean from the same small shop downtown. I stood at the window with my mug and looked at the street below. Ordinary Sunday traffic, ordinary October light. And thought that this was what it felt like when something was over. Not relief, exactly. Not triumph. Something quieter than both. The particular piece of a person who went into a fire and came out knowing exactly who she was and what she was made of. The cuffs had gone on, and then they had come off. And the rest was just Claremont on a Sunday, going about its business, 1 week cleaner than before.